So my talk today, hopefully after 15 minutes, you can take away about my assessment, how we get here in terms of the EMF health effect, what are the challenges, debates, controversies at this point. Before I forget, I want everybody to know this is EMF health effect is not that different from what we already very well know about how we throughout the process understanding the tobacco health effect. In fact, it's the same with other environmental exposure as well, for example, like endocrine disruptor, BPA stuff. So it's not that different. So if you didn't quite understand, because EMF, only difference, EMF is still ongoing, you can go look at the literature has been very well written about how all the process, frustrations, and process of our tobacco health effect throughout the 100 years history. And unfortunately, we were hoping that lesson learned from tobacco experience will make the public health understanding of the measures go much more efficiently, but sometimes history is painfully similar. So that's I want to put out there first. If you have anything, you can go, because I hear a lot of people very frustrated with this process. So what I try to do is slightly different from what Frank just did, is look at overall view, because I'm an epidemiologist. I just, based on my perspective, my experience to more than 20 years in this area studying health effect of EMF, trying to understand what's going on, why there's so much controversial, or maybe even still a lot of misperception, not just in the general public, even in the scientific community. So the EMF health effect was raised back in 1979 by these two scientists. And looking back, if eventually EMF did have a health effect and we're studying it, we have to be forever grateful for those two scientists. But at the same time, just like life events, they left the two legacies, I think, unfortunate legacies that may have contributed to whatever the controversial we have right now, because they look at the so-called EMF, they barely measured any EMF. They basically look the power wire without the wire codes, thickness wire. I don't have time to go into this, but basically they look at they find association actually with this wire code with child leukemia. So they published that paper. Looking back, they were extremely lucky. So in that kind of crude measurement, which basically no measurement of EMF, they were able to find this association, which was fine. But as we know, luck cannot be repeated. So many studies, so they left the two legacy, which number one is, you had a very poor measurement, basically no measurement of EMF. Number two, to look at the outcome, which I deemed is not that sensitive. So a lot of studies afterwards trying to replicate the studies, many of them failed. So that led to the misconception that their EMF was just no health effect. It was just that study was a fluke. But then, of course, a lot of scientists continue to work on this by improving in the concept of measurements. You can see I listed here. People are looking at still trying to improve. Eventually, the best was, I'm talking about the relatively low frequency, like a power frequency. People started invented the meter. They actually can capture the EMF wherever you go. So that's the best so far at this point. So that's what our study started using that. So you can see the top ones that most of study have been using basically are not really measure EMF, even though they claim they study EMF health effect. This is the point I trying to make. If you cannot measure EMF, please do not say your study is examining EMF health effect, because by definition, if you can't measure exposure, you're not going to find any association, even association is there. So just like if you can measure smoking, tobacco smoking, how can you claim when you say there's no smoking relationship with anything, or lung cancer, for example? So that's a very straightforward concept, but it has been plagued with this health because it's difficult to measure, that's true. But then the people wanted to study it, so they claimed the majority of the study out there says they could not find association. There's no association. To me, that's because, number one, you didn't really measure EMF. If you didn't measure EMF, you can't claim that there was no association. So then second one was a cancer, started with Alzheimer's study. So people that focused on the cancer. Now, of course, later on, many years later, the cell phone started showing up. People started looking at the cancer as well because they were focusing on the phone next to the head. So ideal situation was that, not ideal, but that common sense is, oh, you're looking at brain cancer. So the problem with that is cancer is extremely insensitive outcome to study. Yeah, you can study it. There may be effect. It's just very, very difficult to demonstrate effect for the many reasons I'm going to talk about here, the latency. And also the combination of both rare outcome, long latency, they force people to use very crude measurement because cancer takes 25 years. It's rare cancer, so by definition, without getting into it, you have to do case control study. When you do case study, you basically wait until cancer happens, then you go back to ask 25 years ago, what is your EMF exposure? Of course, nobody is going to know that. Even I don't know, and you don't know, even currently, what is the EMF exposure without measuring it. You ask people 25 years ago, what is the EMF exposure? So those totally, exacerbates the problem I just described. So bottom line is you can study cancer, that's fine, but you should shift the focus to study more sensitive endpoint first, so which make you relatively easier and short to find out this effect. So right now, the prevailing concept is still based on the older literature saying that there was no health effect, biologic effect, regardless of what outcome they're talking about. Largely, of course, is based on cancer. So then the debate right now is also whether is power line frequency versus shifting to the cell phone EMF. So people have a debate because yes, they have different frequencies. Cell phone EMF has a much higher frequency, and the power line frequency is much lower. Then there's debate. My question is, they both are EMF. Only difference is the frequency. Just like they both are fat. It doesn't matter whether it's coming from chicken and pork or whatever. Can they be different? Yes, they can. But how likely it's going to be different, someone has to study. But assumption shouldn't be they are different. Assumption should be they're probably similar, and unless demonstrate different. Only thing is though, low frequency EMF, like what we are studying, power line, has a lot of more literature there showing that may not be good, has health effect. High frequency at a cell phone level, there's very little study. Many studies show there's no effect largely because they didn't really measure, couldn't measure. So if you disconnect these things, then you cannot use the evidence from low frequency to apply to the high frequency cell phone. So there's some confusion there, a dismissive attitude. So another thing, the history is people have been focusing on the energy level, largely from the evolving of science. By the way, I'm not criticizing anybody. That's the emerging science tends to happen that way. So people started learning more things and then learn more. So at the beginning, it's a lot of physicists involved with EMF because a lot of biomedical scientists didn't really understand how does this EMF works? What is EMF anyway? So a lot of physicists involved. They had a lot of arguments so that cannot possibly cause any health effect. This level is so low because they're focused on energy. And there's another argument that you don't hear anymore, but I used to hear is like Earth's magnetic field is much stronger. But Earth, without getting into too much, Earth's magnetic field doesn't exist. It's called a static magnetic field. They never changes. So my argument is any species cannot tolerate Earth's magnetic field, which has been here since the beginning of the Earth, which is 4 billion years. They probably never evolved. Our species here, they have no problem with Earth's magnetic field. The question is, we're adding man-made magnetic field. Is there a health effect? So you don't hear this anymore, but sometimes I still get a question from a physicist. So the key thing right now, you need to separate what is non-thermal effect. In other words, most the public care about is EMF causing not a heating injury, is causing cancer, causing miscarriage, causing child disease, or causing autoimmune disease. Those are the non-thermal effects. So why EMF? You probably all know because EMF right now is hugely, almost everybody is exposed, at least in the developing countries. So this is, if this exposure has some issues, we really need to study this because when something is so widely exposed, even everybody exposed, even there's only tiny increased risk, the public health implication is huge compared to something even very toxic, but it's only very, very, very small people, like occupation people exposed. It still needs to be studied, but their public health implication is much smaller. So this is the things. Then also the outcome I list here, mostly from my study, except the blood glucose level that's done by NCI, a study published in JAMA many years ago. They show that at the minimum, that EMF does have biological effect. We can debate whether they all cause those endpoints, but at the least, right now at this point, all we needed to show as scientists is biological. EMF does have biological effect, because in the wider community, a lot of people, or most and majority of people, still, including scientists, still do not think EMF has any biological effect. So now I'm going to quickly talk a little bit, but that's not my focus, talk about what we did. And but just give you an example what is the correct study should be done. And mainly is focusing, we look at the pregnancy. The partly is my focus of research, also partly is, I said, it's more sensitive outcome. Without getting into this, pregnancy is most sensitive period, and any biological environmental exposure can be amplified and also easy to detect, particularly if you look at pregnancy outcome only 9 months. But even when you go to childhood, their offspring, it's usually a few years rather than decades. So that's part of the reason we did. So this study is done in Kaiser, Northern California. We recruited pregnant women during the first and second trimester, and we did the interview, and we certainly conducted the measure. We asked women to carry the measure. So this is the key. We actually measured EMF exposure. We asked women carry not only just the 24 hours, even though that's not perfect. Ideally, you want to ask women to carry throughout their pregnancy, which is not feasible, but at least the 24 hours captured exposure from all sources, not just the home, not just the work, not just when they're outside. Wherever they go, it's captured for 24 hours. And also, we're trying to make sure it's typical. This is another way we have found throughout the study repeatedly, because ultimately our purpose, think about a purpose. Purpose is trying to measure this 24-hour period to truly reflect this woman's true exposure during pregnancy, because that's the period we really care about, even though we can't measure throughout the pregnancy. So one way to do that is after measurements, we ask women, is this your typical day during pregnancy, your activity-wise? So if this typical day idea was, yeah, your measure capture today is probably more likely to reflect your true exposure during pregnancy compared if it's not a typical day. It turns out that was really true throughout the multiple studies. And this is the one we find. Overall, I just give you an overview. We find it double, almost triples risk if you have high EMF exposure. Your miscarriage rate is 2.7 times higher. Your mother exposed during pregnancy, I'm talking about your child during index pregnancy, the child from index pregnancy, you have 250 times higher the risk of asthma. And also we publish almost 5 times the risk of obesity. And we also find a neurological problem with, in this case, ADHD. We also find out that there's 3 times the risk if you have a thyroid abnormality. So we also have, we didn't find those response for miscarriage, as I will explain a little bit of which means miscarriage is the death of the embryos. So once you reach that level, this is probably the explanation why once you above that threshold level, you further high is not going to show any of those response. But for the other outcomes, we did see those response. And we did find a traditional typical day is much stronger association. That's again emphasize the point of how important it is measured correctly. So here is the example of in the context of miscarriage, which we published about a few months ago, which if you overall combine them all together, your overall rate is roughly 1.5, which means 50% increased risk if you have high EMF exposure compared to, I'm talking about a woman compared to the lower one. But if you look at a typical day, it's getting to almost 3 times. And if you measure on a non-typical day, even though you measured, compared to the all other study, don't even measure it. So your risk is gone. If you look at the non-typical day, you will make a conclusion says, oh, exposure to EMF, high exposure in pregnancy, there's no association. So this is another way to basically emphasize the importance of how measuring correctly. So this shows, I just told you, for miscarriage, we didn't see the dose response. Our interpretation could be that because miscarriage really have threshold effect. Once the embryo is there, you further increase, probably not going to find dose response. This is the one we showed actually does have dose response in the context of the asthma risk among offsprings. So you can see this is called a survival curve. That means x-axis going to 3 years or 14 years. So what is your likelihood that you still asthma free? So top line is the ones with the lowest maternal exposure of EMF. You can see they had the lowest, they had the highest chance to survive up to the asthma free. The highest at the lower end, you can see here is has the lowest chance to survival. So it's 60% still asthma free versus 90%, almost 90% the asthma free. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion is we did find, at least in our study, we did find in the context of miscarriage, we have some increase. Actually, we have several studies. We had 2 studies done different times, and there was another study done by Raymond Norch's group, but also published. They reanalyzed, finding exactly the same thing. High EMF does increase risk of miscarriage. We also find a lot of long-term outcomes that needs to be replicated. Those are only published by our groups. So the other people should continue, but we have to be able to continue to study this. If you don't study this, ultimately this EMF effect will be done by determined by science. So, but you have to do science, do it correctly in order to move this forward.